Obviously, there are a lot of questions that we would want to ask about the Kantian position, and there's been 200 years of scholarship already, and I can guarantee you that your local library is full of books about Kant and Kantian ethics and so forth, so we can't get too deeply into it here. But I just want to raise a couple of questions. I mean, one thing is, what's so great about consistency? I mean, poets and artists seem to like inconsistencies in certain ways, and maybe we do in our personal lives as well. You know, do I contradict myself? Then I contradict myself. I am legion, I am many, Walt Whitman, right? But that might be a kind of metaphor, and you might think that really us rational beings, we rational beings, do feel that it's important not to say, I am both listening to a lecture and out walking the dog, just because that can't be true. And we have reason to think that that can't be true. And so we value consistency in a certain sort of way. So what we want to know from Kant is exactly what kind of consistency is involved and how we can revise our views, which we obviously do in moral context, even while sticking to this general thought that rationality requires kind of consistency and not making arbitrary exceptions of ourselves. Another worry is that Kant does seem to just say, look, animals don't have reason. And there might be certain contemporary and more recent investigations into the way animals behave, into kind of proto-morality sorts of behaviors on animals' parts that starts to challenge that point of view. And so we're linking out to some videos, some TED Talks of people who have suggested that animals do in fact have at least a low-level way of reasoning and of engaging in moral practices with one another. So what would that mean for the Kantian position? Maybe it means that Kant would have to open up the circle of what's kind of morally respected and think, okay, some of those beings, maybe at least the high-level primates or something like that, should be treated as ends in themselves and not mere means. Interestingly, in this regard, Argentina recently legislated that certain kinds of high-level primates, orangutans, I think, chimpanzees, are to be treated with respect and called non-human persons. So that's kind of Kantian language. They're persons, but they're non-human, and they deserve certain kinds of respect. So we might think we can keep the Kantian picture, but revise our sense of what gets moral standing within the Kantian picture. That helps with our transition to Tom Regan, which is the broadly Kantian contemporary theorist that we're looking at. He calls himself a deontologist or a Kantian non-consequentialist, and he also talks a lot about the kind of end-in-itself character that certain beings have. They have a certain inherent or intrinsic worth. But he rejects the Kantian thought that non-human animals don't get that kind of worth or standing. So he'll talk, instead of talking about rationality or self-conscious ability to legislate autonomous principles for oneself, which is a pretty high-level ability, he'll talk instead about being a subject of a life. What he means by that, you'll see in the reading, is sort of complicated, but the thought would just be a subject of a life is a being that has certain interests and preferences, that's capable of suffering, that's capable of happiness of a certain sort, capable of pleasure. And these interests and preferences are the basis for certain kinds of rights. So even if they can't speak, and even if they can't reason in this high self-conscious way that we can, they still are subjects of a life, and that's sufficient for us to treat them with certain kinds of respect. For Regan, that means we shouldn't use them or their products in any way for just our purposes. We shouldn't treat them as mere means to an end. But it's important to see that it's still a broadly Kantian position. It's not just consequential, it's not just looking for the best consequences for everybody involved and trying to weigh it up and go for what looks like the best. It's looking for things, subjects, persons, non-human persons that still have a certain kind of inherent value, and then saying, whatever the consequences, even if it would be better to grind up that person and use their organs to treat lots of other people for some sort of virus that's spreading around the world, we ought not to do that because they are deserving of respect and should be treated as ends in themselves. So Regan wants to put the animals in that circle of the moral we that gets that special kind of treatment. Still a Kantian position, but a very different result with respect to animals and the way in which we should eat.